In Ethiopia, a French journalist has been arrested and then accused of conspiring with rebel groups. At the moment, Ethiopia is dealing with at least 2 distinct separatist groups in the provinces of Omoro and Amhara. The country's jailed journalists in the past. Also, for a while, been illegal to use services like Skype in Ethiopia. Angela Quintal heads the Africa program at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Angela, good afternoon to you. From what you know, what happened to this French journalist, to Antoine Galindo?
Thank you. Well, he was arrested on Thursday. He was at a hotel speaking to an opposition politician, and both of them were detained by plainclothes policemen.
I mean, speaking to opposition politicians is what journalists spend a lot of their time doing. Is there any evidence?
Exactly.
Is there any evidence that he was doing anything wrong?
Of course not. I mean, we were flabbergasted, frankly. He had his accreditation. He was covering the AU summit and then asked, and there was a letter, in fact, to the government asking that, saying that he would need to stay an extra week. And he specifically said he was going to be talking to politicians and others. So, yeah, the guy was there. He was there legally. He's been detained. And I think it really just shows how abysmal the conditions are for the media generally in Ethiopia. He's been detained, but there are at least 8 other journalists who have been jailed in Ethiopia and are currently still in jail. And obviously the Committee to Protect Journalists wants all of them to be released.
We've seen the situation in Ethiopia being quite difficult. There was a very difficult insurgency at one point, the separatist groups. Has that put pressure on journalism? Has that made it actually harder? Has the central government then almost been cracking down on journalism, trying to maybe criminalize journalism in some ways?
Well, look, the federal government has always criminalized journalism. But just to say that, yes, with what we've seen in terms of the fighting in the Tigray region, we had many journalists who were detained. More recently, obviously, because of the conflict in the Amhara region, you've had a situation where a state of emergency was actually declared, I think, in August last year. And following that state of emergency, we had at least 4 journalists who were detained. They remain in detention to this day. I said 4 of the 8 that are detained. They have not been charged. They have not been brought to court. So they have been arbitrarily detained by the government of Prime Minister Abiy.
I mean, this is a person who once won a Nobel Peace Prize. Quite difficult to put pressure on him. I imagine he just doesn't listen to any kind of criticism on this issue.
Oh, yeah, very, very ironic, isn't it? I mean, he came into power. Everyone thought that, this was the man who was going to change the trajectory of what is going on in Ethiopia, but also just in terms of reforms. He was at a World Press Day event, which he was hosting with UNESCO, where he said, it was very, very clear about how wonderful it was that there were no journalists in jail. Well, a couple of months later, we started seeing the pattern starting, journalists being arrested and jailed.
It's not just Ethiopia, and I think you could almost make a correlation, and obviously I can't be entirely objective here. I'm a journalist myself, or I call myself one. There's a correlation in a way between democratic space and journalism. We've seen coups in Africa, military governments taking over in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. I presume that has a big impact on journalism too. Very difficult to report on a coup, very difficult to know what military government will do to journalists.
Very, very, very difficult. There's censorship, but I think that what you need to also observe is that even in that democratic space that we're talking about, journalists are also routinely detained. Once upon a time, for example, Senegal was seen as the beacon of press freedom in Africa. And now we have, for the first time in years, we have actually 5 journalists in jail. So it just shows that it doesn't mean that if you're considered a democracy, that you are going to leave journalists alone. I think at the end of the day, it is a case of people feeling that journalists are the messenger. And if they want to control, if authorities want to control that message, one of the things to do is to arrest the journalists, throw them behind bars, and think that the population is going to be in the dark, well, not be in the dark, will be listening to their own official narrative. So, yeah, but it's been a tough year for journalists, 2023 in Africa, obviously in the world, but just to say that in Africa we've had 67 journalists imprisoned. That's according to our latest prison census. So 67 journalists on December the 1st were actually in jail. Yeah, you know, that's certainly been one of the highest for the African continent. Just in terms of my own region, Sub-Saharan Africa, we had 47 journalists detained last year, again, according to our prison census. And that is, I think, up from 31, yeah, in 2022. We've also had the murder of journalists, and so in terms of what we've seen on the ground, we have documented at least 6 journalists in Sub-Saharan Africa. If we take the whole of Africa with Sudan, there are 7 journalists. So it just shows that, yeah, journalism is regarded by some governments as a crime, and that journalists are obviously put in dangerous conditions, and if they're on a dangerous assignment, they may well be killed, as we saw in Sudan with the death of a journalist there. And then, of course, you also have journalists who are uncovering corruption, who are seen to be the enemy. And let's look at Cameroon, which had 2 journalists who were killed last year for their work. So is journalism under threat? Yes, it is under threat in Africa and elsewhere in the world.
Angela, our government, in fact the governing ANC and the leader of the ANC, President Cyril Ramaphosa, have almost regularly now praised journalism, thanks journalists in South Africa, not individuals, but just the entire profession, for the work that they've done in uncovering corruption. And in fact, even again at the manifesto launch, they spoke about the importance of media freedom. If media freedom is important for South Africans, is it important for the rest of Africa? And could that mean that perhaps our government and our president may have a duty to speak up when journalists in other parts of our continent are jailed like this?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. You know, we have actually previously reached out to the government of South Africa saying, you know, please use your diplomatic channels to at least whisper in some of your colleagues' ears, you know, try and see whether they can put pressure, use the back channels to try and ensure that journalists are being jailed. Well, you know, we're not seeing anything happening in that respect. But I must tell you, and just taking you back a couple of years back when Thabo Mbeki was actually the president, the one thing that Thabo Mbeki did was he refused to go to a African Union's event that was happening in the Gambia because of a jailed journalist. And he said he would only go if that journalist was released. Well, that journalist was indeed released. Love to see something like that from our current government. Instead of sitting at the African Union in Ethiopia, talking about what's happening in the continent, don't forget that there are at least 8 journalists in jail in Ethiopia, the very country that the African Union is in. And don't forget that currently there's also 1 journalist from France who has been arrested, also been detained arbitrarily, for doing absolutely nothing wrong, for doing journalism.
Angela Quintal, thank you, head of the Africa program at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Really do appreciate the time. Important just to understand.